Robin did such a beautiful work describing the sounds. I'm going to give a kind of quick historic overview from my point of view, so I hope you'll excuse me. In the last few years, the landscape has changed beyond recognition in both global drug policy and psychedelic science. Society seems to be entering a new, more balanced understanding of psychoactive substances and their potential use in medicine. Finally, the psychedelics are a subject that can be discussed and even researched, and cannabis is slowly moving towards a regulated market in certain parts of the world, most notably the United States. Our long work chipping at the rock face of the taboo seems to be finally breaking through. However, although there are many promising developments, the extent of the research is still very small, and the obstacles put in its way are immense. These include the problem of getting ethical approvals, the problem of obtaining the materials, which can cause delays of years and vastly inflate the costs, the problem of storage, and the problem of finding funding, among others. It is an amazing indictment of human society that these naturally occurring substances that have played such a vital role in the cultural evolution of Homo sapiens, aiding our development of language, spirituality, music, art, and medicine, became taboo. They've always been shrouded in mystery, but it is interesting how they become toxic in the mind of society, moving from being known as the food of the gods, the vine of the soul, the sacred leaf, to the substances of damnation and criminalization. It is a sad reflection on modern society that these compounds that formed the psychoactive essence of the transformational rituals throughout history, from the prehistoric caves to the soma drunk by Shiva, the elixir of Eleusis, and the brew of the Amazonian jungle, should now be designated by our highest authorities, the United Nations, as a Schedule I substance, i.e. highly dangerous, with no medical benefit whatsoever. These substances are as tightly controlled as nuclear weapons, with trillions of dollars spent on trying to eradicate them from the face of the earth. Quite obviously an impossible task, so why try, one might well ask. Interestingly, our latest research at the Beckley Imperial Psychedelic Research Program throws new light on this perplexing enigma. Our research shows that under the effect of psychedelics, there are changes in the brain which include the reduction in blood supply to the controlling repressive network of the brain, the so-called default mode network, which is a modern neuroscientific terminology for what Freud called the ego. By reducing its blood supply, its activity is reduced, censorship and tight control diminish, and a more open, primal state of consciousness takes over. But there is also advantages to the disintegration of tight control. There is more contact and interaction between different parts of the brain. Different networks, which normally have high integrity within themselves, but little communication between each other, start communicating. This explains the dissolving of the normal ego state of mind, which is looser and less controlled, into a state of mind which is looser and less controlled, a state more conducive to creative thought and problem solving, to the mystical experiences of unification, and to being able to reach and clear out repressed trauma. By uncovering the mechanisms underlying the actions of these strange compounds, psychedelics, that interact so intimately with the human body, we can learn much about why they can be such valuable tools in the healing of so many of our most intractable diseases, such as depression and addiction. They interact with our neurotransmitter system and bring about changes in consciousness, such as unblocking set patterns of negative or self-destructive thought, washing out long-embedded repressed trauma. By combining the new art of brain imaging with psychedelics, which perturb the functioning of the brain and bring about changes in awareness, we have the luxury of being able to know what a person is experiencing subjectively, while correlating this with the changes in blood supply and functional connectivity within the brain. An amazing new window of opportunity, similar in importance to the discovery of the telescope or the microscope. The value of psychedelics is that they bring about states of consciousness different from daily consciousness. Before their use in research, normal daily consciousness would be compared with sleep or psychosis, or possibly more recently meditation. Now, with psychedelics, the field of research has opened up to a much wider spectrum of conscious states. A well-directed neuroscientific study can provide invaluable information about how a psychedelic substance changes brain function and how it may be harnessed to treat disease and enhance health, well-being and creativity. Brain imaging studies are an ideal complement to clinical trials. They provide new discoveries to drive medical advances, as well as new explanations to give medical research a powerful neuroscientific underpinning. To backtrack a bit in my personal life, in 1996, I had become passionately interested in the physiological mechanisms underlying altered states of consciousness and the ego. I had met a Dutch scientist of exceptional insight, Bart Huges, who had developed two new hypotheses, one concerning the irrigation of the brain and the changes in blood supply to the brain underlying altered states of consciousness, and the second describing the physiological basis of the ego as a conditioned reflex mechanism based on word recognition, which directs blood to those brain centers most essential for survival, while repressing blood flow to other parts of the brain. This was the first time that a mechanistic explanation of the ego had been given. It also provided the first explanation of how brain functioning can be altered by such practices as deep yogic breathing and the ingestion of psychoactive substances, to name but two. The underlying theory is that the techniques bring about a change in blood supply to the brain, together with a loosening of the repressive control of the ego mechanism over consciousness. With an understanding of these mechanisms, I found I could take control of the changing state of consciousness brought about by LSD. With a moderate dose, together with vitamin C and glucose to maintain the blood sugar level, I could keep my mental concentration for creative thought and disciplined work. Higher doses would enable a more mystical and psychological exploration. The expansion of awareness added sparkle to perception, allowing me to think deeper, see further, and feel more sensitively. A whole new world opened up. I was so inspired by this new knowledge that I decided to devote my life to researching and communicating it. In the enthusiasm of the 60s, we thought societal change was just around the corner. This came to an abrupt end when the establishment panicked, terrified by the new freedoms of the youth. The prison doors of Prohibition slammed shut, scientific research more or less came to an end, and prisons began to fill. The new explanation of the ego as a conditioned reflex mechanism superimposed over the rest of the brain could not in those days be tested empirically. However, with the development of more advanced brain imaging technologies, and particularly fMRI in the early 1990s, it became possible to observe the changes in blood supply and brain function correlated with subjective experience during both normal and altered states of consciousness. In 1998, I set up the Beckley Foundation with two main aims. Firstly, to investigate consciousness and its changing states, and secondly, to reform global drug policy. I invited some of the world's leading scientists, including Albert Hofmann, Sasha Shulgin, Colin Blakemore, Dave Nutt, Les Iverson, and Dave Nichols, among others, to form a scientific advisory board. I realized that policy and science are intimately interrelated, and that it was essential to change policy in order to move the science forward. Now the positive results coming from the scientific research will, hopefully, begin to move the policy forward. They work in synergy. I also realized the enormous value of the very best science in breaking the taboo on these substances. I won't spend time detailing 17 years of policy struggles, but after 15 devastating years of prohibition, the cracks in the edifice are beginning to show. When I founded the Beckley Foundation, all drugs were inherently evil, destructive, and antisocial. People who used them were criminals, misfits, and unproductive members of society. There was no word for use, only misuse or abuse, no acknowledgement or research of their potential benefits. They are still in Schedule 1, and Theresa May, our Home Secretary, is currently planning a bill to ban all psychoactive substances other than those approved by the government. As a minimal reform, these substances should be redesignated to Schedule 2 to facilitate research and permit doctors to prescribe. However, although changes on the ground are rare, I think the intellectual battle of the war on drugs has largely been won. In the last few years, the hegemony of the United States has diminished, and Latin America has gained in strength. Presidents in the region, such as Perez Molina in Guatemala, Santos in Colombia, Mujica in Uruguay, have called for a policy reform. Even President Obama has endorsed the need to explore alternatives. Within the citadel of prohibition itself, the United States, over 50% of the population now live in a state which has embraced new approaches to cannabis. Beyond the US, countries such as Guatemala, Colombia, Uruguay, Czech Republic, Portugal, Spain, and now Jamaica are explaining a range of alternative policies to regulate cannabis. An additional factor is that the US no longer needs the war on drugs to enter the countries it wants to. It now has the war on terror. Reforming policy has always been my duty, as such enormous suffering comes from our present policies. My passion is the science. Surely the best game in town is to better understand our consciousness and how to enhance its functioning. The Beckley Foundation scientific program, perhaps in the Beckley Foundation scientific program, one of my greatest triumphs was, in 2005, I think, persuading Dave Nutt that we should set up a collaboration to research the psychedelics. This gave birth to the current Beckley Imperial Psychedelic Research Program, and I'm delighted to be working with so many great scientists, not only Dave and Robin, but now there is an expanding team. To date, we have had a very productive partnership, and now finally, we have just completed our first LSD research, which I have wanted to do ever since I experienced its immense potential in the 1960s. The studies so far are only opening the door. The future holds much to look forward to. It is fascinating to compare and contrast the underlying actions of the different compounds, psilocybin, LSD, cannabis, ayahuasca, MDMA, among others. These explorations throw light on their amazing effect and teach us more about their potential benefits. Some of the other exciting projects that I am currently involved in include a series of studies in collaboration with Jordi Riba in Barcelona, investigating ayahuasca and DMT, a study with Val Coran at UCL, investigating the different effects of cannabis with and without cannabidiol, CBD, a study with John Beeson, Matt Ben-Sessa, investigating the acute effects of MDMA in war veterans suffering post-traumatic stress disorder at Cardiff, with Yuri Moskalenko in St. Petersburg, continuing the series of studies investigating changes in cerebral circulation and age-related disease, plus researching the effects of trepanation. A follow-up study of the amazing, successful pilot study at Johns Hopkins with Roland Griffiths and his team, using psilocybin as an aid to psychotherapy in the treatment of nicotine addiction. With Michael Bogenschultz at NYU, we're in the process of developing a study with LSD in overcoming alcohol addiction. How lucky we are to be in such a rich orchard with so many low-hanging fruit, which can bring about such change. Thank you. And
I've been researching psychedelic research around the world, and one of the things that has struck me is how often I see your fingerprints on it. You know, your name's on papers or as a funder. And there's an enormous range to the kind of research that you've been involved with. I wonder whether you could perhaps start by helping us understand, is there a common theme here or denominator? Is there a central question you're trying to answer?
Yes, yes. I mean, my overall interest is consciousness and its importance to the individual, but also to society. And it's been a taboo subject, even consciousness has been taboo. Francis Crick said that, you couldn't get the grant, consciousness was mentioned in it. But also states of consciousness is way beyond the taboo. And I came across their value in the 60s, actually before they were prohibited, and I realized how they can change consciousness in ways that we can use in many, many different areas of life, and their incredibly deep potential benefits. So I wanted to...
and this grew out of your own experience.
Yes. And most importantly, meeting this scientist who described to me the physiological, or the hypothesis of the physiological explanation of what underlies the changes, so that one could understand it and try to use it productively in more than one or two ways.
Right. You know, one of the things that, getting to know you over the past few days, and you describing your past use of LSD, is that it's very different than what you usually hear about. I mean, you usually hear about the LSD trip as this overwhelming, devastating experience that doesn't really allow you to be functional in normal life. And you've described something very different, though, a way to kind of modulate consciousness and use it while conversing, saving the world, painting, reading. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, it suggests that our understanding of it might be a little bit limited.
Well, taking the kind of basic hypothesis that it changes the volume of blood in the brain, and when you have more capillary volume, you are feeding billions more brain cells, and therefore the natural sugar level, which you want to keep same for concentration, can fall. And in order to concentrate, you need the energy of the sugar, because cognitive functioning is a late function, it's extravagant in its need of glucose. So when we use LSD as a tool to get to the level of consciousness that one could best function at to carry out tasks like cognitive tasks, studying, reading, thinking, writing, doing things. And there's a certain spot where you can get an elevated state of mind, but you can keep control over that consciousness. So it's a different kind of way of using it to the more basic way, which also has its immense value. And I think that hasn't really come over into society. And I think I look on psychedelics as tools. I mean, obviously, a mystic can get that top highness of cognitive functioning and experience within themselves. But psychedelic tools are just aids in that way. But I think it's very important to know how they work in order to use them optimally. Mm-hmm. And so my whole work has been trying to investigate how they work and how one can then communicate it. And it's midway, so I've been working with one of the leading specialists in the world in cerebral circulation, Professor Yuri Moskalenko in Russia, who's way beyond where the West has gone, to understand how cranial compliance goes down in old age. And I think these substances in low dose can be very valuable for the aging process, for creativity, for all sorts of areas. I mean, like Stephen Jobs said he'd have never discovered or whatever he did without so many people want to say their experience with psychedelic has given a breakthrough, which is helped.
Talk a little bit about creativity. I mean, this is something that hasn't been studied recently, as far as I know.
No.
And is this an area you're interested in advancing? And how do you think creativity is a difficult thing to measure?
That's the trouble. I think the present tests of creativity don't test for creativity. They test more for thought patterns, intelligent tests. And I think we have to really examine how does one test for creativity. I mean, from my old tests, I used to do it playing the game Go. I don't know if anyone knows, but it's a completely intellectual game, and you're dependent on thought. And, well, anyway, I found I could play a better game, win more games, if I was taking the right quantity of LSD and keeping my sugar level normal. Then my game improved, my creative perception of problem solving on the go board was enhanced. So I think that's quite a good test if one could set it up in a brain imaging thing with people who play Go. And but as I advertised, I've got hundreds of people who answered that they'd come from all over the world. But at the Beckley and Piero, we're planning to do an LSD and creativity test coming on next, one of the things we will be doing.
Using Go or not?
Well, we have to, as a field lab, we have to have what is highly acceptable and scientific. But I do think the modern tests need to improve, because I did do a study with cannabis and creativity, and the tests just weren't good enough, really.
We only have a few minutes, and I want to turn a little bit to policy and politics. You've been at this for a very long time, probably as long as anyone in this room, if not longer. You've seen the arc from general tolerance or acceptance to prohibition to this renaissance now coming, which must be incredibly gratifying to you, and to see all this interest in the topic. In the long game, what are you working toward? Are you working toward a medicalization of psychedelics, or do you see a wider use than that? Is your goal legalization, or what?
I think really, I'd say my goal is regulation, strict regulation to minimize harms and permit freedoms. And there's all sorts of different levels. I mean, obviously the first portal door to open is to reschedule these substances. It is just a mistake how they're scheduled. Science must be able to research these incredible substances, and doctors to prescribe them where they think fit. And I think that's number one. But medicalization and the medical aspect is definitely an incredibly important avenue to explore. But we have to also remember that around the world, millions of people are using these substances. And the harms that are coming from them are very little when you look at the chart of harms compared with alcohol or tobacco. And we need to give those people the best protection that they can have, which actually having them all in the criminal market is not good for anyone. It creates $1 billion or billions of dollars, blah, blah. We all know the harms it does, but it also doesn't protect the youth. So somehow one wants to encourage policy. What I've done in the Beckley is try to give policymakers the best scientific evidence base that they can get. And at the moment we're doing 2 reports on how to regulate different substances. It's a very difficult question, but I think that we have to re-look at it with the aim, how do we minimize harms at every level of the different substances in their different productions? I mean, obviously, criminality make them get stronger ever. We want to put them in the hands of knowledgeable people rather than the criminals, and have licensed outlets, which, you know, teams of educated, sensible people work out to, like a good parent. How do you, you know, how do you manage it? How do you reintegrate these substances into society? It's a minority sport who wants to use these things, but instead of making them criminals, make it like in shamanic society. They're respecting the people who go to the further shores of consciousness. It's not for everyone, but those people who do, don't just make criminals of them. And people who want to have therapy with a psychedelic, there should be techniques where they can get that, because the evidence is that it does have, in many, many cases, not every case, but many cases. So we want to aid the the health of the people by permitting it.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time. I think we'll leave it there, but please join me in thanking Amanda Feilding.